Mother Teresa. You know the name? Even if you just vaguely remember her from a history textbook, you probably picture the same iconic image. That small woman in a white sari, radiating serenity while surrounded by the sick and impoverished. It's an image synonymous with selfless service and compassion. It's also an image that earned her sainthood in 2016, a mere 9 years after her death, which is fast, even for the Catholic Church, an institution that, and let's be honest, takes its sweet time with these things. But you know what they say, the path to sainthood is paved with, well, a lot of things apparently, and not all of them are particularly holy. Because beneath that saintly veneer, there's a more complicated legacy, one fraught with troubling questions and uncomfortable truths. So buckle up, because today we're taking a long, hard look at the woman who became a global icon and asking the question, was Mother Teresa really a saint or just incredibly good at PR? Let's start with the basics, providing care for the sick and dying. Seems simple enough, right? Well, when it came to Mother Teresa's facilities, the word basic takes on a whole new meaning. We're talking about allegations of reused needles, a shocking lack of essential painkillers, and medical care that could generously be described as rudimentary, at best. Think about that for a second. Imagine being in agonizing pain, your body ravaged by illness, and the best you can hope for is a bit of aspirin and a damp cloth. Now, some might argue that this was simply a case of limited resources. After all, Mother Teresa was working in some of the poorest parts of the world. But here's the thing. Her organization, the Missionaries of Charity, was raking in millions upon millions in donations. So where was all that money going? Well, it certainly wasn't going towards fluffy pillows or, basic pain management. And that leads us to the rather uncomfortable possibility that Mother Teresa's vision of care wasn't about alleviating suffering, but rather embracing it. She believed quite explicitly that suffering brought people closer to God, which, is great if you're into that sort of thing, but perhaps not the most comforting philosophy when you're literally dying in a cot next to someone using a bedpan. Now, let's talk about those donations, shall we? Critics have long questioned what happened to the millions of dollars that poured into the Missionaries of Charity. Allegations suggest funds were funneled into religious work rather than improving care facilities. It paints a rather stark picture, doesn't it? Now, I know what you're thinking. Dave, you're being a bit harsh. Maybe Mother Teresa was just a product of her time. And you know what? You're right. It was the 20th century, not exactly known for its progressive healthcare practices. But here's the thing. Mother Teresa wasn't just accepting of suffering, she actively seemed to glorify it. She often spoke about the beauty of suffering, how it brought people closer to Christ. Which, again, if you're into martyrdom chic, that's fantastic. But for those grappling with poverty and disease, it's less inspiring message and more profoundly tone-deaf. This wasn't just some abstract theological debate, mind you. This was a philosophy that had real-world consequences for the people under her care. By prioritizing spiritual salvation over physical relief, some argue that Mother Teresa may have inadvertently prolonged the suffering of those she claimed to help. But hold on, because it gets even more complicated. Turns out Mother Teresa wasn't just accepting donations from well-intentioned grandmothers sending in their pension checks. Oh no, she had a knack for attracting some seriously dubious benefactors. We're talking dictators, corrupt businessmen, the kind of people who usually try to buy their way into heaven's VIP section. Take, for instance, Charles Keating, the mastermind behind the infamous savings and loan scandal that cost American taxpayers billions. Mother Teresa not only accepted a hefty donation from him, but she also publicly defended him, even as his victims were struggling to pick up the pieces. And let's not forget about Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier, the Haitian dictator notorious for his brutal regime and rampant corruption. Mother Teresa was happy to accept a medal from him, seemingly unconcerned about the whole oppressing his own people thing. Look, I'm not saying she was directly endorsing their actions, but cozying up to these kinds of characters does make you wonder about her judgment, and whether her pursuit of donations sometimes came at the expense of, basic moral standards. Now, it wouldn't be a proper exploration of Mother Teresa's legacy without addressing the elephant in the room, or rather, the very large, very controversial issue of reproductive rights. Mother Teresa's stance on this was, to put it mildly, unwavering. She was vehemently opposed to abortion and contraception, and I mean vehemently. We're talking in all circumstances opposed. Rape, incest, poverty, overpopulation, none of it mattered. To her, any form of birth control was a sin, a stance that critics argue was not only deeply out of touch with the realities faced by countless women, but also contributed to the very cycles of poverty and suffering she claimed to be fighting against. It's one thing to hold personal beliefs, but when you're in a position of power and influence, those beliefs have consequences. And in Mother Teresa's case, those consequences were felt most acutely by the women who were denied agency over their own bodies and reproductive choices. Chapter 6, Conversion Therapy. Was saving souls the true mission? Now, some might argue that despite her flaws, Mother Teresa was a deeply religious woman motivated by a genuine desire to serve God. And you know what? They're probably right. But here's the thing. What if serving God and serving humanity weren't always one and the same? Some critics, most notably the late, great Christopher Hitchens, argued that Mother Teresa's primary goal wasn't alleviating suffering, but rather increasing the Catholic flock. They point to her organization's focus on baptizing the dying, often without their explicit consent, as evidence of a more cynical agenda. It's a harsh accusation, but one that raises uncomfortable questions about the true nature of her mission. Was she a selfless saint, or a shrewd operator more concerned with saving souls than saving lives? Chapter 7. Behind the halo, a lack of transparency and accountability. And look, even if we give Mother Teresa the benefit of the doubt, even if we believe her intentions were pure, there's still the issue of how her organization operated. And to put it bluntly, transparency and accountability weren't exactly their strong suits. Despite the millions upon millions of dollars flowing in, the missionaries of charity remained remarkably opaque about how those funds were being used. There were no independent audits, no public financial records, nothing to reassure donors that their money was being used responsibly. And that lack of accountability, that unwillingness to open themselves up to scrutiny, only served to fuel suspicion and raise further questions about what exactly was going on behind the scenes. It's almost as if, once you achieve that level of sainthood in the public eye, you're no longer subject to the same rules as everyone else, which, let's be honest, is never a good recipe for ethical conduct. Chapter 8. Sainthood Express, a rush to canonization? Which brings us, of course, to her canonization in 2016. Now, sainthood is a complicated process, even for the Catholic Church. It usually takes decades, if not centuries, of meticulous investigation, verification of miracles, and general bureaucratic wrangling. But Mother Teresa? She got the fast track. 9 years from death to sainthood. That's like ordering takeout and having it delivered before you even finish dialing the number. And that speed, that haste, has led some to question whether the Catholic Church, eager to capitalize on her global fame and iconic status, may have glossed over some of the more inconvenient aspects of her legacy. It's hard not to see it as a cynical move, a way to bolster their image and distract from their own internal struggles. Because nothing says we're still relevant like canonizing a globally recognized figure, even if that figure might not have been quite as saintly as they appeared. Outro. The complicated legacy of a complex figure. Look, it's easy to judge from the comfort of our computer screens years after the fact. And it's important to remember that Mother Teresa's supporters argue she was operating in incredibly challenging circumstances with limited resources. They maintain that her focus was always on spiritual care, not material wealth, and that her work, however flawed, brought much-needed attention to the plight of the poor and inspired countless acts of charity. And they're not wrong. Mother Teresa's story is a complicated one, full of contradictions and complexities. She was, by all accounts, a deeply flawed individual who also dedicated her life to serving others. But sainthood? That's a whole other level. It requires a level of scrutiny, a reckoning with both the good and the bad, that I'm not sure Mother Teresa's legacy can withstand. Ultimately, it's up to each of us to grapple with the uncomfortable truths and decide for ourselves whether her halo was earned or merely a well-crafted illusion.